it's Brad Laurie or Blockchain Brad, and today we're speaking about a startup that many people at the moment do not know about. It's been in stealth mode for some time, and it's called Moonbeam. Now, to explain this in detail and really help us unpack and explore it clearly, we have Derek Yu here to explain it, and his experience is vast. He has a lot of years in software development, and he's also been the CEO and still is the CEO of PureStake, and is one of the key developers for Moonbeam. So Derek, thank you very much for being here to let us all know about Moonbeam.
Oh, thanks so much, Brad. Yeah.
You're very welcome. Now, mate, as I said before, you do have a lot of experience in that software development sort of vertical or industry. Can you just touch on your experience before we jump into either PureStake or Moonbeam? It's just good to hear a little bit more about your background and expertise.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. So, yeah, I've been kind of building software for quite some time. So, my career basically started in the 90s, kind of with the first internet wave, and so for over 20 years now, I've just been building software as a service. Cloud has kind of been my area of focus historically, and I think the notable thing I did, been through a series of startups, but did start a company along with another guy named Steve Kokinos back in 2006 called
I know
Fuse.
Steve. I know I've talked to Steve.
There you go. So, so the two of us started Fuse back then, and worked on that for quite some time. So, a good 13 years, I think I was there, building up, that company over time. Left there last year to start PureStake. But at the time I left, that was a 700 person company, $150 million run rate cloud business. So, kind of learned quite a bit in that process of going from the two of us up to like a pretty big company. There was, call it the kind of the book of many chapters. There was the bootstrap startup phase, and then there was raising financing, and then there was building out this building out our product and expanding out to different geographies. So quite a bit of learnings in kind of that.
I see. And if I can just interject there, it's interesting you mentioned Steve, because having spoken with him, his connection to Algorand, obviously leading that out right now, he has a lot of business skills. He's an entrepreneur by nature. And then clearly with your experience, you bring developer skills to the table. So obviously that's going to be optimal for the scenario you're now in. So let's discuss that in the context firstly of PureStake, because that was something that you were focused on prior to Moonbeam, as I understand. So do you want to just touch on that so we can better understand later the relationship with Moonbeam?
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, we started PureStake last year, so I think it was in February of 2019. And, this was, I don't have like a kind of a crypto kind of history going way back, right? It's really in discussions with Steve that I had, come to understand and kind of learn about crypto. I mean, he had left to start the Algorand project. And so the initial idea with PureStake is that we really focused on infrastructure work. So this would be kind of DevOps infrastructure work. We did and continue to work, with in and around the Algorand ecosystem on a lot of infrastructure work. So nodes, API services, developer tools, and that's really where we got our start as PureStake. And I think what happened then is a bit later in the year. I mean, we're believers here in kind of like a multi-chain future, right? So
yeah, we're going to get into that. Don't worry.
Yeah, we don't think there's going to be one. So we kind of asked ourselves, okay, well, where's like another place where we can kind of engage and kind of that we're interested in that supports some of the ideas that we think are important, and that's what led us to Polkadot. And we started there, running some validators, learning about Substrate. And that's kind of the journey that kind of brought us to, to the idea for the Moonbeam project and building a parachain.
I see. That's really interesting. And also the point that you had that experience through Steve and also your own knowledge base with Algorand. And that multi-chain point you mentioned, I think, is really the crux of Moonbeam in many respects with the cross-chain focus. And we're going to dig deep into that today, because that is arguably something that does set you apart, especially at the smart contract level, which I want to dig into. So let's discuss this. Let's start with this multi-chain advocacy. Clearly, you're a proponent of that. So why is it? Why does it matter? Why should we step outside of the silos that we currently see as blockchain innovation evolves?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always kind of think about these kind of historical examples, particularly in the history of technology. So this idea of cross-chain integration or cross-chain communication, I mean, I just think of it, in multiple ways. I mean, one is just, in the history of networks, I think in the early days of networks, there were these, proprietary vendors. There was, people had different technology stacks, and there was these different, you could have different LANs, but they didn't talk to each other. And, the introduction of kind of standards that allowed these different vendors, these different networks to communicate, really set the stage for, these protocols and these kind of applications that became, the first wave of killer internet apps. I mean, I would say email first, and then web. So, I mean, to me, it's kind of just almost self-evident that the ability to communicate across these different networks where there's value and interesting things being created is going to be a whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
I see.
Kind of idea.
And Derek, what went wrong in 2017 then, in 2018, in the sense that, having interviewed a few people back then, let's say, the discussion then was very much around interoperability. There was a strong number of startups emerging at the time with white papers. And clearly today, if we fast forward, there's a lot more empirical proof of tech being done. And there's been a lot of things built since then. So what's the difference between something like 2017's context and today, when we talk about those bridges, those key ways to engage and network the systems that exist and the platforms that exist?
I mean, my take is I think that the tech is just hard in this area, right? So even some of the, experienced people, I have on my team that have come in to look at this is, they kind of, have already given me feedback and saying, hey, this is, these frameworks and really thinking hard about the tech here is, pretty hard relative to a lot of the problems that exist in the Web2 space. So I think it's just, it takes time to develop, the right tech stacks to make this, easier for developers to consume and leverage. So take something like Substrate. I mean, that's been worked on here for 3 years. So I think that, to really build, these frameworks in such a way that it really makes it easy to use, that can enable, these cross-chain interoperability scenarios, it just takes time. The bridges that exist, I'd say that they're largely kind of point-to-point bridges. So, really when you look at, I think, Cosmos to some extent, Polkadot, these are the first networks where interoperability is kind of really built in, as a core part of the design of the system. And that's really what, has drawn us, to these, to Polkadot in particular.
Right. It's interesting, especially when we hear the likes of Ethereum leading out the narrative of smart contracts, and then hearing the likes of Cosmos being now in the discussion, and certainly Polkadot, and possibly even others coming forth, in the future as well. Exciting times. Now, what about things like consensus? What about things like proof of stake? That seems to be a common thread among these new and emergent flat platforms. Why is that? And where's the value in transitioning from something like, the first iterations of proof of work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the, proof of stake, I mean, I would say all networks launching these days are proof of stake based. That seems to be capturing most of the mind share. I mean, my take is a little bit this, that, for a lot of projects, what consensus mechanism, is being used, I think will become a less interesting question over time. That seemed to be what a lot of people were differentiating on in the early days. But to me, it's kind of like you take kind of the, using a framework like Substrate, right? There's different consensus options there. And I think, ultimately it's going to be, just a technical choice that people make to say, hey, I'm going to use, this consensus mechanism versus this other one. And I don't know, I think it's going to be less interesting over time. I mean, really the performance of the system is kind of what matters. And
sure,
some of these technical details will get kind of buried further down in the implementation stack. It's like when people are talking about a web application, they don't talk about, well, do you use a threading model or a dispatcher model, or, there's these different
it's a really good point you make
when you're building a web app, but it's not that, it's just, I think it becomes kind of a interesting technical detail, but not really something that you're leading with in terms of features.
Okay. Now that is exciting, considering that the options will be built in I guess that's part of the tooling suite. But when it comes to proof of work, perhaps that is different. And with your skills and your knowledge of the, development evolution of blockchain melded with crypto, we saw the likes of Bitcoin, for example, really capture the imagination of everyone, especially for that censorship resistance narrative. Now, when it comes to tech, though, when it comes to smart contracts, everything changes. And suddenly proof of work becomes, very specific use case, arguably. So does it really suit the mold when we know, as you said, that beyond proof of stake and the whole suite of options there, that's fine. But is proof of work in that mix?
Yes, obviously I think there'll always be a place for Bitcoin, and its proof of work system. I think that it does have, some interesting characteristics. And the main thing that I see is, a bit challenging is kind of the finality that's associated with, proof of work-based systems. Generally they're going to have this probabilistic finality. And that makes it a little bit challenging to, for certain class of use cases when you're kind of waiting a long time, right, to kind of be able to depend on the results. Now, I do think that, it does kind of, you take something like Bitcoin, obviously it has these, very nice properties in terms of censorship resistance. So, that's a positive. I think for us in Moonbeam, like, again, kind of back to this, use of substrate. I mean, I think that's something where, there's just a dramatic reduction in the amount of effort you have to put in to create your own blockchain when you can use a framework like Substrate. I mean, it's, I don't think people appreciate this, but, to do it from scratch is obviously doable, but a pretty like massive effort to build, your own blockchain from scratch. And, using, a framework like Substrate, is it 10, is maybe 10% of the effort? I mean, it's some like vastly smaller amount, right? And I think that's going to become clearer, as people really, as Polkadot launches, and people can really understand, like, when they look at their options. Well, do I want to build from scratch, or do I want to use a framework? It's gonna. I mean, same thing I saw in the early web days, right? I mean, in the early days, you had people kind of writing their own web stacks, right? These low-level pieces of web infrastructure, and then web servers and these app servers came along. That kind of did a lot of that for you, and everyone moved to those, basically, right? I mean, it's just a matter of expediency sometimes.
Right. And one of the things you do talk about, or is referenced in some of the literature as well, is just the imperative of infrastructure. And when you reference things like parity tech, or in your case, you've been talking a lot about Web3, and particularly the substrate, all of that affords for infrastructure that, once again, entities like Moonbeam can utilize, optimize, and not have to start from scratch, which, why do so and reinvent the wheel when there's technology that's been building for years. So in that context, I wanted to understand Moonbeam for a moment in terms of the agenda for being agnostic somewhat, whilst, very much a proponent and using the substrate and supporting the Polkadot framework and technology. You're also very much a proponent of Ethereum, given the context of the past. So do you want to just touch on those two ecosystems as well in connection to Moonbeam?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, just to describe, kind of the key idea behind Moonbeam. So, we aim to be a parachain on Polkadot. So that's basically what they call, blockchains that connect into the Polkadot network and are able to talk to, other blockchains that are connected to Polkadot. But at the same time, we want to be an Ethereum compatible smart contract platform. And we're really striving for as good and as close to Ethereum compatibility as is possible. The idea is that we really want to support, the existing, Ethereum-based applications, the existing Ethereum developer tool chain. That's really driving a lot of the technical work that we're doing now, is to make sure that we have, this kind of compatibility feature set that'll make it, relatively easy for, applications that exist to extend themselves, onto Moonbeam, that are kind of developed using the Ethereum stack, let's call it.
I see. It's super exciting because we've seen already a few years now of building in the Ethereum network. We've seen the likes of Consensus building out their own sort of enterprise-centric tooling model as well. But let's pull it back to Polkadot for a moment, because it does sound like the origins or the focus is still from that parachain out. Once again, using all of the technology of parity and of the substrate as that sort of bedrock. Is that right in saying that? Are you stemming from Polkadot out?
Well, I would say that it's kind of a standing on the shoulders of giants situation here. So, we have this, as a starting point, this whole substrate kind of framework. And in addition, there's a number of existing Ethereum compatibility components that are even part of substrate or are developed by parity. That's like a huge kind of head start for us in implementing these features. So specifically in Substrate there is an implementation of the EVM that we're using. We're collaborating right now with the parity engineers on developing some of these Ethereum compatibility features. There's an engineer named Wei in particular who's been quite helpful to us. And in general, Parity's been quite supportive
yes.
of our efforts.
I followed him today. I found him today.
There you go. So, I'd say that, the key features that, are kind of our immediate targets. One is this, full EVM implementation inside of Moonbeam. So we really want that, so that if there's anyone who has an existing smart contract, we want the execution semantics, we want the behavior of the thing to be reliably, kind of the same as what it is on Ethereum. But the other piece is basically a Web3 API implementation. So that's basically an ability to support all of the Ethereum-based tools, as well as any front-end dApps that have been developed. We really want to be able to support those with minimal change required.
I see. And what about
the third piece is that bridge? So yeah.
And what about platforms like Cosmos? Obviously, they have a connection with Web3 as well, as you'd appreciate. And then we see the likes, obviously, most definitely with Polkadot, because of the Web3 connections with Gavin, for example, as the initial president of Web3. See a lot of interconnections with these platforms, especially Ethereum and Polkadot. So it reinforces what you're saying about that multi-chain narrative, really just breaking down this idea that Ethereum has to lead out wholly and solely the smart contract platform of tomorrow. Now, in saying that, I've noticed that you do interact with a lot of the ETH devs. What do you think their sentiment is when they see the likes of Moonbeam emerge, or starting to really show its presence, have the multi-chain idea, when we know that many of the devs are maximalists when it comes to Ethereum over there?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I mean, my genuine hope is that we don't want to be a kind of a competitive or some sort of like, that's not our goal. If you look at how we're building the feature set, we really want to support what I would call kind of a hybrid deployment, right? So we want to basically be a valuable option to existing Ethereum projects to help them enhance and extend their existing deployments. And so one of the patterns that we're quite keen on is this kind of idea of, so let's say that you have an existing Ethereum based application, and we want to support a hybrid model where you basically extend that application like to Moonbeam. And so that does two things. So one is that I think it gives you a nice option for moving some of the workloads that either are expensive on Ethereum or are things that you can't even do on Ethereum due to cost. You can move them to Moonbeam. But at the same time, you're kind of extending your reach into the Polkadot ecosystem and potentially into like any of the chains that are connected to Polkadot. So kind of that interoperability play. So that that's kind of the concept. This kind of idea of, hey, like just move your thing, move everything wholesale over to like some other platform. I mean, that's not gonna, that's just not like a strategy that makes sense, basically.
I see. So is it fair to say that Moonbeam in many respects is agnostic, at least in philosophy, even though you're basing it on that parachain structure and that core technology, because you're also utilizing Ethereum in some respects, you're in the gray zone. Really trying to capitalize on the network effects also of Ethereum. Obviously a huge boon for you because they are so well established. But I wanted to better understand more so, what your feedback has been from the Ethereum dev camp in terms of why establish Moonbeam when they have what they would deem as a very successful smart contract solution, or smart contract platform rather. And I wanted to try and better understand what you bring to the party, what you bring to the fore with regard to perhaps iterations beyond it, so that people can better understand why we need to see development beyond what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, well, I think obviously for one, we want to create this compatibility environment so that people can use all the familiar tools. I would say that some of the key benefits, that for someone adopting Moonbeam are, I mentioned one is basically just throughput and cost. So there is kind of a scalability option there. There are a number of scalability options that are emerging on Ethereum now, particularly in the layer 2 area. However, we see kind of Moonbeam as a lot of those require like a lot of change to people's applications. Mm-hmm. And they kind of are like their own chains. A lot of them, or they involve movement of assets to another off of the main chain. And we kind of see it as, well, I mean, here's an option that minimizes change, allows you to get some of the same scalability benefits, but then has this kind of extension of reach that those other solutions don't have, right? Where you can kind of extend your reach into the Polkadot ecosystem and beyond into other chains that are connected to Polkadot. And I would say that this is something where, I mean, there is interest, I would say, for a lot of Ethereum projects in understanding what's happening and exploring and kind of, expanding their market, let's say, to users and assets that are in, some of these new emerging ecosystems.
Yes, I've actually noticed that myself, and some of the ETH devs are now considering integrating also into the Polkadot ecosystem substrate, at least exploring the possibilities. Now, in the context of enterprise, it gets really interesting because once upon a time, there was this idea that DeFi was at one end of a continuum and that centralized enterprise was at the other. But now we see a very different narrative play out where you can potentially have the best of both worlds. And we see the likes, for example, of Baseline emerging, challenging that notion, that age-old notion of we forget the old guard and we move into a new, but rather they're trying to bridge, with no pun intended because of your own technology, bridge those worlds of enterprise with emerging technology so that they can optimize as well. Now, in the context of public and permissionless designs, the Baseline links well with consensus and Ethereum. Clearly, with Polkadot, it's a similar narrative of public and permissionless. So are there thoughts, with regard to Moonbeam to also bring that market share in, bring the enterprise into the space and allow them to tinker with smart contracts from Moonbeam?
Yeah, it's an interesting question about this enterprise. So I'd say that again, I think I see some historical kind of analogies with some of the early kind of internet days here, where I think in the early days of the internet, right? Businesses that were exploring and adopting the new technology, they generally kind of wanted these private like deployments, right? So like they had what they called intranets. They were completely cordoned off from like the outside world. It was just something that the employees inside the company could access. And I think that's kind of similar to what we've seen, where people want, enterprises, the first thing they want is kind of yes, we're interested in that, but we want like a fully private deployment. I think, that narrative is starting to shift, and people understand the value of public, but it's a little bit of a scary leap for most businesses to go all the way to, okay, we're just going to build on top of a public platform.
Yes.
So my take is that, these, kind of supporting like a hybrid model again here, like different hybrid than what I was talking about before, but a hybrid where you have some parts that are private and some parts that are, that private instance can connect back and speak with, public networks. I think that'll be a valuable stepping stone, even if in the end, it might be just like as it is today with the internet, that people are comfortable, enterprises are comfortable deploying, just fully public applications. You kind of need to like a path to get people there, right? So this idea of kind of having, an interim hybrid deployment, I think, is something that will be quite attractive to enterprises. And you can see that, for example, I think, Algorand even like has, this, are pursuing this idea with their co-chain kind of concept. And, I think, a system like Polkadot also, right, has this idea of having multiple chains that can connect and talk to each other.
Exactly.
So I do see that pattern is like important for, as an important part of what enterprise.
And it seems like that all of that knowledge you're talking about and that experience and that network you have personally is going to lend itself well for the time in which Moonbeam can capitalize on that. Because obviously you're still building out the technology, you're building out towards mainnet, you're building out towards really being known and sort of tinkered with, as we talked about in the space. But beyond that, it's about starting to see how, to what degree and how much mainstream inclusion or experimentation happens. Now, one of the things I also wanted to better understand is also just the roadmap itself, in terms of where you've come from, where you're at right now and where you're going. Especially when we reference the technology, to really understand what's underneath the hood in that engine that is Moonbeam, and who's building it as a team and where you're going.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. So I would say that, roughly speaking, like we are focused right now on, we're deep in implementation. We are just about to release our first, we'll call it our DevNet, where people can start trying out these Ethereum compatibility features. I see kind of, this, we're right at the cusp or the first day of the Q3 now. So like Q3 for us is really about our testnet and kind of getting our testnet launched. We plan to have just a Kusama-based deployment. So just to step back on that, we are following what I'd call the parity same model in terms of deployment, where we will have a deployment on Kusama, which is the Canary network for Polkadot. First. So we will kind of deploy there first, under real economic conditions. kind of vet the system, and then once we've gone through our security audits, we'll deploy onto the Polkadot mainnet. So we see our Kusama deployment as something that's coming at the in Q4 at the end of the year, and then our Polkadot mainnet deployment would be in Q1 next year. That's kind of our
and I like hearing that you're not rushing. You're making sure that you take the steps that your team need. Now, in saying that, there isn't a great deal of information yet compared to other startups out there for Moonbeam. But certainly, say I wanted to delve deeper and I wanted to understand better the tech stack. Where are the best resources to go? Are there things like white papers that are really clear? Are there resources that I can go and educate myself on, for example, with Medium?
Yeah, we are. I would say that there's been limited information to date, but we are just this week launching a website, docs.moonbeam.network, that will have a lot of information on it, including
Awesome.
I think we're working mostly on guides to help people get started so that they can understand how to use Ethereum tools like MetaMask, Truffle, Remix, how these tools can be used, against a Moonbeam node. And really, we're looking at this point to engage with a broader set of folks to help us, flush out any issues as they're using these tools for their use cases. If they hit issues.
And
so that's forthcoming shortly.
Right. And do you converse much with the likes, for example, of Consensus? You mentioned Truffle. They certainly are looking at that as well and making sure there's a lot of tooling available for all sectors of that quadrant, from private to public, from the permission sector, even the permissionless, when they're experimenting. But, we also mentioned before that focus on Rust. And in that sense, there's a big push from Moonbeam to make things easier, for that reason. So do you make things easier by just building something that's more efficient, by making sure it's built on something already established? Or is part of being easier also interconnecting with other established software companies like Consensus as well?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, we have been in conversations with a lot of these folks in the Ethereum ecosystem, the tool creators in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a lot of them, a lot of them also see that there's an expansion in the number of networks out there, and they're interested in helping support those networks insofar as there's not a lot of work to get their tools to kind of support the tech stacks of the other networks. I'd say your first point is definitely correct, that we're aiming to make things easier. I mean, I'd say in general that something like Substrate, it's a Rust-based framework, is quite powerful. But there is you do have to invest some significant time to learn Rust. For a lot of people, they don't know that already, and there's a lot of things that you need to kind of think about if you're going to pursue kind of your own blockchain implemented with Substrate.
Right.
And so we see it as for a number of use cases, kind of a smart contracting platform is kind of easier, and will be kind of a quicker route to market for a lot of projects that don't need that full level of control of all of the underlying blockchain internals.
Right.
So we kind of see that as we see our role. If you take kind of the Polkadot centric view, we see our role as kind of adding optionality, right? So we add, there's a great set of tools in Substrate itself, and there's even some smart contracting tools, right? There's something called Ink that's part of Substrate.
Mm-hmm.
But we see us bringing to the table the option to use these Ethereum tools to build within Polkadot as well. So
right. And Derek, do you see yourself as positioning Moonbeam as something somewhat akin to Ethereum for Ethereum, in the sense that, yes, you have Polkadot underpinning everything with also the Substrate and Parity, but do you plan on being that go-to platform for those who do want to build smart contracts? Is that the idea for being, to have that kind of reach throughout the entire Substrate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely a need for smart contracts within, even if you just look at Polkadot, right? So people can build their own chains, but you'll always still, for some use cases you need a smart contract, and even in this multi-chain scenario, what's becoming increasingly clear is if you want to kind of compose functionality from the different chains. Let's say you want to take price data from a chain link and you want to combine that with you had them on your show, right? A stable coin like AUSD from Akala. Where are you going to combine those things, right? So I think it makes sense to, for some of these composition scenarios, to combine them on a smart contracts platform before they're presented to the user. So that's becoming a clearer there. And I think we want to, be a valuable option, as people look as people have that need, and we want to be a valuable option. And we think, providing support for this existing kind of tool set, is something that, it's just what a lot of people are comfortable with already. And there's a huge amount of documentation, tutorials, other kinds of materials that already exist, for these tools.
Absolutely. And we also see now, some of the volatility, some of the technical question marks now being asked with regard to these first movers in the smart contract domain, Ethereum, obviously, and the Solidity language being part of that. What would you say to those devs who are biting their nails right now as well, Derek, thinking, oh, are you possibly an Ethereum killer for me? If they're so well sort of entrenched, or if they're really so bullish on that Ethereum ecosystem, should they be worried in any way?
Well, again, I think we don't want to be seen as, this kind of term Ethereum killer. I don't like. I guess we certainly don't want to be seen, that way. And I think we're more interested in these kind of interoperability scenarios where we can kind of help and exist in these like coexist basically, right? In ways that are mutually beneficial to everyone. That's kind of where that's how we see things.
I see. And in that sense, I'm not wanting to ask you, do you know Gavin Wood personally? Because obviously he was the CTO of Ethereum. He's moved across to build much of the tech stack we're talking about now that you're going to be utilizing. And I would imagine he's certainly supportive of both of these technology stacks.
Yeah, so I don't have a personal relationship with Gavin, although I do look forward to meeting him when when travel resumes and one can still can kind of physically go to the same place. But he has tweeted support and and other things for us. I think it's kind of funny, I guess, that we're combining like multiple ideas, key ideas that he's worked on in his career. We're kind of, we're at the intersection of like multiple of those, given our project. So.
Got it. Well, I wanted to ask you a tough question. That is, in the era when we saw, all the time, it just seems like an age ago, when white papers were the reason for speculation, look quite literally all the way from VCs to the retailer, because that's all we had in the beginning. How far are you ahead in terms of proving when it comes to things like GitHub, open source code? How far along are you so that people can start to go beyond just the narrative itself? Even this conversation, for example, sounds great. But how can we go beyond that to really start to see empirical proof that you really are building what you say?
That's right. So, we do have public GitHub repos. And maybe perhaps we can put a link to those in
Absolutely.
And as I mentioned, I think this doc site that's forthcoming will be quite helpful to get people started on being able to download, compile what's in those GitHub repos, and then start the guides that we put together demonstrate just how to start using existing Ethereum tools, how to configure them to point to Moonbeam node and work with them. So I think that's kind of that's been our focus. And in terms of the white paper thing, it's like at this point I think we'd rather just like show kind of working code and scenarios rather than spending our energy writing about things. We do have a draft of something, but I'm tempted to just say that we want to just put our energy into this doc site so that people can just hands-on like look at things instead, right? Maybe that's more.
It's very 220, very progressive thinking, because we're now ready for that kind of thinking. Back in 2017, maybe we weren't, because a lot of people were just dipping their toes in. But now we're very much in the space of I guess utility and seeing things have real adoption in the space. One of the things I did want to ask you is about the team and advisors. I'm assuming there may be some. How can we start to explore the expertise of different team members as well? I found that difficult to try and find information beyond you, actually. Will you be publishing more information about your team, and what is the size of your team currently?
Yeah, so we do have some information on the PureStake site about some of the team that we have. So there are 15 of us right now. I think that the core group that's kind of implementing Moonbeam right now is there's 2 dedicated engineers that are kind of on the core part of it, and as well, obviously there's myself, Katie, Nate. So there's some other folks that are kind of non-engineers that are kind of helping with a lot of the materials,
doing important roles,
site, other things. Right. Yes, exactly. So we are, looking at ways that we can, expand our efforts in this area. But right now, we're making, I feel pretty good progress, even with the team that we have. I think that for example, the technical lead, for Moonbeam is someone I've worked with for many years back at Fuse. I got him Alan. He's been quite, he's been going quite deep on substrate and working with, some of the folks at Parity that we mentioned before on the Moonbeam implementation.
I see. Well, it's good to know that you have those connections again, because that really affords for an accelerated entry into this domain that is already quite convoluted and complex. But to make your mark known, it's always good to have a runway as well, to have substantial funding. You're young, in terms of a startup, quite relatively now in this time and as you enter. But how did you start? What is the funding? Did you do an ICO? Did you do an IEO? Did you do any kind of private funding? What was the the beginnings for you?
Yeah, I would say that we're actually in the fortunate position to be, more or less self-funded like right now. So, we have been in some conversations with some VCs. I mean, we are now making, the existing energy we're putting into the project is all self-funded, which gives us a lot of options, right? And so, we're considering our options here, but for right now, we're just focused on implementing, with the team we have, and we think we're making good progress there.
Right.
And
Okay.
we'll see kind of what if and when we need, we kind of engage to raise more funds. I think that's these are all future.
Well, Derek,
don't need it right now.
The good news is that you also once again have connections to very powerful people, especially knowing Steve, for example, who had to lead out what was one of the big raises, one of the big rounds as well with Algorand. That required a lot of conversations, a lot of connections with VCs at that time, I'd imagine. So it's going to be interesting to see what plays out. But my thinking is top tier. Without trying to sort of subject anyone to FOMO, the reality is that you do have the access to top tier when it comes to funding. So interesting to see what happens there. Now, just in terms of, I guess, the staking model itself, we've talked about the value of staking more generally. But then we saw recently a change in Polkadot where they switched from one to another in terms of their own design to NPOS. Do you want to just touch on why there's tweaks happening there? Why are they moving and iterating in that way? And what's the value add for them?
Well, I think the staking model that exists on the relay chain, is kind of the main chain that supports, both, there's one on Kusama and one on Polkadot, has always kind of used this NPOS model, which is a staking model that has some unique kind of attributes, right? So I think the main one, if you contrast it with the staking model you find in something like Cosmos, is that it tends to kind of have this kind of more distributive effect, right? Where kind of all of the validators there, they tend to get kind of evened out a bit, I think, in terms of rewards, versus a straight DPoS model, right? Where if you assemble more, delegations, you kind of get a larger part of the revenue stream, right? That's going to support the security budget.
Right.
Chain. So, I think that's led to some interesting things. I mean, and I think you have some folks that are kind of then trying to run multiple validators, like on Kusama in particular is kind of the thing that you can look at as an example right now, and led to some different dynamics there. But I think that it's certainly an interesting model, and like there's quite a large number of validators that have kind of raised their hand to kind of help support Kusama, and I imagine there's a lot of people who've raised their hand even like for Polkadot mainnet, which is now in kind of this launch process, where it'll shortly be transferred over into this NPOS mode.
And what's interesting also is that it does change the governance design as well when we do that contrastive and comparative analysis with others. They do set themselves apart with the way in which that they afford more security and improve their governance model over time. And that's something obviously you can look into with Parity and listen to some of the discussions I've had with Joe, and I'm sure you've looked into that as well. But in saying that, I really wanted to touch more so on Kusama for a moment, because one of the things I did tweet out of your own actually was a comment about how it's not just simply that test net. There's a lot of misnomers out there and misperceptions perhaps about Kusama. Do you want to just talk about why launching there means a lot more than what people think as just a testing ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a variety of different points of view on what it is, and that narrative is evolving now. I guess I tend to think of it a little bit more towards like I think what the original idea was. And if you think about it, I think about it this way, right? I mean, there's just a practical problem that it solves, right? So when you're launching these systems, blockchain systems, like it's hard to kind of simulate these like real economic conditions to flesh. So there's like a whole class of different like issues, bugs, other kinds of things that's hard to de-risk for, right? And
Mm.
I think, what we've seen is people, have kind of invented this idea of the incentivized testnet as a way to try to flush those out. The thing about an incentivized testnet is, well, that's great if you, right before you launch your network, you have one of those and you help, use that to flesh out issues. But that's like a one-time thing. I mean, if you're going to be evolving this chain, particularly, if you use a stack like Substrate that has built-in upgradability, via governance, this isn't just a one-time thing. This is something that needs to happen all the time. So I think that, from my point of view, the practical kind of thing that it solves is, it's almost, think of it like it's almost like a permanent incentivized testnet, but like calling it a testnet's not quite right, because there's like obviously real economic value. You can trade the token and other things, but it's kind of going to serve that continuous need of kind of being a place you can deploy to early to like vet out like any issues that are not just straight technical issues, but more issues around the economic design and this kind of thing. And I think that's part of the thing that is attractive about this model is that I come from this Web 2 world where it's like you're releasing a lot, right? I mean, you release like multiple times a day, like when you get good at it, right? And it's kind of that's one of those weird jarring things. You come into this space and you're like, oh, like there's like one release a year. It's like this is like that's like what people did like in the early 90s or something. It's like it's like or like shipping hardware, right? Where you got to do it once and there's this huge risk of like problems where it's going to be hugely expensive to fix. So I think using this upgrade, this on-chain upgradability combined with having something like Kusama, helps you at least get a little bit back to this idea that, hey, we can release more often and just kind of be a little bit more agile and a little bit more responsive to what customers want. Maybe not all the way to this multiple releases per day, but at least better than the kind of once a year that I see from
right. And the analogies that Parity have put forward as well, Derek, with regard to how to perceive the continuum between Kusama and the likes of Polkadot. I mean, really, that's essentially what's emerging. We're not seeing just two simple points of value. And the analogy was that the symphony as opposed to something like the garage band. And we now see that Kusama starts there, but perhaps can evolve itself into its own design, its own sort of wild symphony at some point. But right now,
that's kind of the beauty of these things is they sometimes, the things evolve in ways that the creators didn't imagine. So I think that, we can see if Kusama evolves to have its own personality and its own deployments where that's kind of not just a stepping stone where they're just home there. I mean, that would be interesting.
And certainly there are audits in place. That's the other misconception as well. It's not just simply this wild canary network that has no audits in place. And again, that strengthens the launch for you, I think. So just to clarify as well, what's the time frame for that launch with Kusama?
Yeah, I would call it's going to be in Q4 this year. So like
right.
Towards the end of the year. I mean, obviously, we may hit like challenges that are unforeseen at this point, but that's kind of at least our plan right now.
Got it. So in the context of mainnet, in terms of your own roadmap, does that align with the Kusama launch?
Yeah, so I think that we should, with that timeline, we should not be held up by, lacking features like on Kusama, right? Because definitely, in keeping with this model, the thing that's being worked on heavily right now is parachain functionality to come to Kusama, within the next, I'm not, the next couple months, maybe. I'm not obviously Parity will have the final word on when it's coming, but I know that is kind of the plan. Is that there's a lot of heavy work going on right now in terms of parachain support, on Kusama, and then I think we're quite interested in kind of a lot of the major features that are coming down the pipe after they launch. So there's parachains first, then there's this cross-chain messaging kind of functionality.
Is that the Parathreads?
No, this is this XCMP. So.
Okay.
XCMP is basically the functionality that allows for message passing and kind of lays the initial groundwork for how cross-chain integration is going to work. That's coming as an upgrade post launch of the parachain functionality. And then there's beyond that even there's something called Spree, which is kind of this shared logic that's needed to support a lot of the cross-chain integration scenarios. So we really want to kind of be up on Kusama so that we can be some of the early implementers of these, cross-chain integration functionalities and help be a proving ground, to demonstrate, cross-chain integration scenarios, particularly on Kusama first.
Well, it's exciting to hear that you're one of those first in that first wave of innovation and technologies that are really experimenting with the potential of that whole tech stack that's coming out of, I don't know what to call it, but the Web3, the combined efforts of Web3, Parity, and Polkadot. That's all part of the mix of value for you. Now, one of the things I thought found really interesting was that looking at your own, that following in Twitter, well, Moonbeam itself rather, I saw that, as I mentioned before, a mix of different interests, from Ethereum to cutting edge tech, potentially the future with Emin, for example, with Ava Labs. Then I saw the likes of obviously followings from Carla all the way through to Joe, Lubin, Gavin, naturally, and then that mix of some of the Ethereum devs. So you really do, well, Moonbeam does, they back what they say with the people that they follow. And I always think that's interesting to look at, because once again, you're proving that the investigations, the network of people as well, links to that idea of multi-chain. So I just thought I'd mention that. And certainly with regard to the Ethereum devs, it was impressive to see, that there is potentially dialogue happening, with some of them and their support for something like Moonbeam. Now, with a tough question, and that's tokens. No idea personally what's actually the plan, and certainly you would know. So we touch on that because all the speculators would want to know, but more importantly, those who want to use the token would want to get some direction for devs, for example, and for those wanting to create something.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little bit limited what I can share at this point because we're still not finalized on what exactly the model will be. But there are definitely will be a token. It will have a utility function that's similar to Ethereum's model, right? So we have a gas system. It's part of Ethereum compatibility. We need to basically have support for a lot of the same use cases as is on Ethereum. So that means use of the token to gas meter smart contract execution is obviously one of the important use cases. I would say in terms of additional things, and this gets at some things that are different about Moonbeam over Ethereum. And one is certainly all of the on-chain governance that you alluded to earlier. We do plan to include all of those on-chain governance modules that come from Substrate and use those to govern the system as well as drive upgrades. So that'll be another key use for the token. And I think that we're getting close to having a model that we can kind of publish. It'll probably likely go to this stock site first that I mentioned in terms of what the model looks like. Some of the notable things I'd say that are perhaps a little bit different is that we will have a model that I think our experience in running validators like on these networks has been kind of pretty informative, and perhaps gives us a little bit of a different point of view than. And
the big question will be, could that be also where some of the funding connections come in with regard to some of the big funders, the big VCs, or even beyond that with real perhaps mainstream parties that want to come in? I mean, we saw the likes of Algorand, for example, and the way they built that out was quite impressive and a lot of work. And you have all of that experience and you have all of those past histories to build your own model on. So how long have you been building this for, this token model?
So I think we really started this project in earnest earlier this year. So it's I would say that it's been since, let's say, the January-February timeframe. So right. We are still we're definitely down the path, but we still are we still, it hasn't been that many months since we started.
Got it. Well, it's tough. I know it's a tough question because you want to keep some of this tight-lipped. I totally respect that. But one of the things I guess is the big challenge is having that stamp of approval from the top down. In the case of the US, obviously the SEC and CFTC, but even more broadly with the likes of other regulatory bodies in different parts of the world. You've seen again, referencing your mate Steve and Algorand. Just to have that recognition from the top is significant. We've seen, even if we go back to Ethereum, the transition from the question mark of security into an accepted utility, which did happen for Ethereum. You want that to be the case for Moonbeam. So are you confident that that will happen?
Yeah, no, I am confident that will happen. And obviously we'll need to get the right, I do have connections to a number of folks that can give the right advice on, how to do that in in a way that is compliant and won't run us into any trouble. So there is, and there definitely is. I would say that I would comment there that as I've kind of understood all of that, you take something like, a lot of focus goes on to the implementation sometimes of, hey, we're implementing a blockchain. Here's our engineers. Here's Substrate that helps us with that. But there's almost an equal amount of thinking and work that needs to go into these other areas, and that's a little bit more. there's less published material, I guess I would
And
say.
I totally respect that, because we're talking about money. We're talking about, essentially money that drives security in networks, and I think it would be remiss of me to push this too much, given that we really do want to allow you that space and time to make sure that you have all of those stamp of approvals in place as you announce your official launch of the token. But exciting times. Now, just in terms of, as I said before, the future possibilities of capital raises, there may be something that comes through, but will that be related to the token, or will that be equity for those parties?
Yeah, I would say that's still TBD. I mean, I've seen a range of interest from, I've seen some people, I think there's a range of interest there, like from investors, as to whether they want, a combination model or just one. I mean, the key concern, I think, from if you put yourself in the investor's point of or shoes, is that they just want to make sure that they're kind of aligned with the team, and that they don't, there's not some asymmetry where, if they make a token investment, but then the value accrues to the equity of the company, that there's something where there's kind of a misalignment.
Yeah,
that being said, I think there are some folks that only do token investments, right? So
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we're kind of just leaving the options open for now. And like I said, I think we're in the fortunate spot where we don't necessarily. This isn't like existential. We need this. I mean, we're still we can make progress just as we are today. And so I kind of don't see it as like this this thing where I think a lot of other people, given even the economic circumstances these days, are in this much more of a it's much more it's like an existential question versus
exactly. I mean, like you said, you have runway that's available to you regardless of the scenario. Now, when it comes to numbers, design of the actual token model, is that any of that published yet, or is that still in the making with regard to cap, for example, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say that, I think we're closing in on a model, but I guess I don't want to kind of share details quite yet, because there still might be some final adjustments, but we do plan to publish kind of details, on that onto, this doc site that I mentioned, relatively soon.
That's exciting. Now, in that sense, it gets tougher, these questions, and I do apologize, but obviously exchanges are part of the access for the public as well, to engage in the speculation aspect of pre-utility, because that's what exchanges allow, and quite rightly they do. So what do you anticipate there? Again, you do have tier 1, tier 2 connections, I would assume, right across the board. So do you think that some of these exchanges are going to support Moonbeam pretty quickly once things move?
I guess we'll see. It's hard for me to speculate on kind of what they'll do, but I would say that like that has not necessarily been our focus. Like that's on our focus right now. We're just really focused on kind of the technical implementation right now. We feel we need to just get further along with that. As you mentioned, it's kind of great to kind of have the ideas and talk about them, but I think in this world, I mean, you just need to have demonstrable functioning code, and that changes the story quite a bit. And so I think that's kind of our main focus right now is on that.
And of course, absolutely respect that position, because that's what we want to hear, to be frank. But Q4 is just around the corner as well, so not long until your launch on Kusama. By then, I would imagine that there will be some conversations with some of your team, or certainly at least there'll be interest from exchanges, regardless of whether or not you want whether you support that, because we see that happen where there's those independent listings that emerge, and liquidity obviously is part and parcel with spreading the opportunity for developers, to engage, and then seeing that monetary connection to it. Even more reason, we've seen the likes of Ethereum, for example. Some of the value built into that, the ETH price, is not just solely and wholly the dev price or the utility price, but there's also that speculative aspect of that as well. So based on everything we've seen, is it possible that we're really going to see a flourishing of uptake here in Q4, moving across to Q1 next year?
Yeah, I would like to think so. And I mean, it's a good point you raise there, that obviously, as part of this launch and having liquidity, the important parts for us are, being able to fund, continued and increased, protocol kind of development, but also to, have some set of funds to help, with ecosystem development, right? So I think that's what I wanted to get to. Quite important. So, I think that, those are kind of the key things, from our point of view, that we want to.
Right. And from a developer's perspective, and also the teams, and even a foundation, as you alluded to, as price goes up based on utility value, very exciting for the potential for grants to build out your own ecosystem to also support others. So is that also part of the vision as well, is to use
That's right.
funds in the future to really build out the Moonbeam ecosystem?
That's right. That's right. And I think that's almost, I would say, it's like kind of the key, the key thing for us is to be able to, support that, right?
Right.
And I think that we want to be able to do that. And, I think that as part of this also, this broader, Polkadot ecosystem, right? To like help, help bring, new developers in to engage with that network, right? And, and one of the reasons we like it is that there is this kind of idea that as people engage, then kind of the value increases for everyone that's connected to it, right? So,
yeah, certainly if you own Dot, I would imagine in the future too, the way things are playing out with just how important that's going to be, as a marker of value for the whole network. Chainlink is another one I wanted to talk to you about because, as you know, they have a very zealous group of supporters in that community, and quite rightly so. They've earned their position, as I've come to really understand their decentralized network. And it's clear that Polkadot have also embraced the technology more specifically. What about Moonbeam? What's the position with regard to the substrate? As I understand, there's a strong connection with Chainlink there.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been in conversations with them. I mean, I think we certainly plan to like integrate with them, as they come online on Polkadot. I would say that for, it's just a numbers game, right? So for the projects that we've been speaking with, many of them are DeFi oriented. That's just a numbers game at this point, I think, because there's a lot of DeFi projects, that are out there. But I would say that, one theme, of a few that have come out in terms of challenges or things that, these DeFi projects would find valuable is around like Oracle price data, right? So, insofar as, we can provide, granular price data via a Chainlink integration, combined with a quicker block time and kind of this like, faster speed that the proof of stake based approach will afford us, versus the proof of work system that's on the Ethereum mainnet. That's valuable to DeFi projects, right? Because I think that's one thing that's either expensive or, I think constrains their ability to compete with centralized offerings right now is this access to, granular price data. So, that's definitely something, and I think that's a good example of things that I think as we, get further engagement with projects, we do have the opportunity to build in like at the base layer, useful services, that I think will be easier for us to do given our model. Then, obviously there's a whole process, but it takes a while to make changes to the Ethereum.
Right. And what's exciting too, also with Chainlink integration or partnership with the substrate, it just lends itself even more to that multi-chain narrative because it is an agnostic tech that can actually be utilized beyond Ethereum itself. And this is proof in the discussion we're having now. So it's exciting times. Now, with regard to some of the other up and coming startups that are emerging from the substrate, I even saw startups like Centrifuge, for example. You mentioned Akala. There's others as well. Are there any specifically, given that we've recently seen Polkadot DeFi emerge as a conference that really showcase some of them, are there some that are really key to supporting you, working in parallel, that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, certainly like the, some of the, like, for example, take like this, like they call a stable coin. I mean, these are all things that, as these cross-chain integration features come into play, I mentioned before that we really want to be, on the leading edge of being able to demonstrate these integration scenarios, of being able to, move AUSD like onto Moonbeam, being able to work with it from the smart contracting chain. The bridges that are being built to Bitcoin, that's another example of something that I think creates some interesting, opportunities. Centrifuge is worth mentioning. We do, work with them as a partner today, even. And I think if you think about I'm not sure how familiar you are with the project, but basically, they're a project that has an existing footprint on Ethereum, and then they've built their own substrate chain. The reason they did that is because the data that they needed to post on chain, kind of the economics of that, didn't make sense in the context of just putting that on the Ethereum mainnet. So now they have basically a footprint on the Ethereum mainnet and a bridge connecting to like a full substrate, like app specific chain they've created that helps support their use case. I see that model as like a pretty good model for what we're after here, right? Because in their case, they had the wherewithal to create their own substrate-based chain to kind of, offload these functions and provide this, kind of place where they could store all of these invoicing data that they need for their use case.
Right.
But, we kind of figured that like we can help, make that same idea possible for other projects, but kind of cut out or kind of make that substrate implementation part a lot easier by just deploying onto Moonbeam. But again, in this kind of hybrid model, like where for them they need to still connect back to a bunch of DeFi and other services on the Ethereum mainnet. But then they want to have this other environment that they can use for their use case in kind of a more efficient
I see. It's it's a conversation that's certainly worthy of a deeper dive just on hybridization, and because we've had that conversation, not you and I, but it was a common thread back in 2017-18, but the technology wasn't quite right for that then. I mean, now we see that there is that plausible approach where we can see that integration. We can see, like for example, the way Centrifuge approached it, they did that based on a needs basis to try and optimize their own situation. And now we see Moonbeam doing the same, and many others hopefully will follow suit. So it's great to know that in the future, there's not this narrative coming from so many that it's one or the other, but in fact about embracing the best of blockchain and beyond to really build out a more complete system for the future. I think that is the sort of conversation that's going to unite a lot of people, not just with Moonbeam and the substrate, but just more generally across all verticals and all industries, and most importantly, all platforms. Now, I've talked too much in that comment. I just wanted to finally finish off the interview with you today, Derek, and just ask if there's anything you wanted to say, perhaps I've missed, anything that you want to really add, drive home to everyone trying to understand and unpack Moonbeam, those key points of value.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's short-term things that I think are of interest that I've mentioned in terms of just solving some practical problems around scaling, around reach. But really, for me, it's this vision of integration between chains and having that be something that's becomes easy over time, right? Really reducing the friction for that. That's kind of the thing that really motivates us. I mean, I think that's the thing that we believe is going to be much more important and open like a whole variety of new use cases. Once that becomes something that you can just add a few lines of code and do, versus it being a whole right now to integrate with the chain is like a whole project, right? You got to create a whole project.
Exactly.
And it's almost like just to even get that in place, it's a whole project before you can even build the project on top of that. So I mean, I think that is kind of the key thing for us, that we really want to create a place where it's super easy to create some of these cross-chain integration scenarios. And that's not easier said than done. That's not going to come right away, but that is really the thing that excites us and motivates us. And I think that's the thing that was really going to drive some significant change and kind of open a lot of opportunities moving forward. So
I see.
I'd say that's the thing I would leave.
Well, Derek, thank you so much. As someone who's a key member of the Moonbeam team, CEO also of a very important technology that's emerging now, or an important team as well with PureStake, you're doing a lot of things that are leading up to what I would imagine would be a time in which many people will know a lot more about Moonbeam simply by the sheer nature of what you'll do. Literally that act of praxis. The proof in the pudding will be what you're doing. So just to recap very quickly, we've really touched on the imperative of multi-chain. We've talked about compatibility being one of those core assets for Moonbeam. You've got the strength of the tech that's backing you as well, and that's all the way from parity to the substrate itself. And then you've also got those very important conversations moving across into the Ethereum dev teams, those who are wanting to perhaps, migrate without losing the value for Ethereum itself. We talked about also, in terms of development, your team is going to most likely grow as you build this out. We know that in Q4, big things are happening with Kusama as the first move in the mainnet and launching, sort of direction, and then from there eventually across into next year for Polkadot itself. So big things coming for you. It's all going to happen very fast since we are now in Q3. Derek, I wish you all the very best, and I really do want to catch up with you sooner than later so we can start to break this down a bit more, really let people understand what Moonbeam's about, and hopefully other educators as well will get on board and start to educate about what you're doing, because quite simply, smart contracts matter. They are a way forward for the whole industry, and you're doing something that is innovative in this space.
I appreciate all the great questions, Brad. So yeah, let's definitely keep in touch. That'd be great.
Absolutely, mate. Well, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll catch up soon. Take care.
All right.